Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our new Primus interview. And today we're honored to host Dr. Nigel Ashford, coming from the US but originally from Britain and famous, well, I would say around the world for his contribution to liberal ideas and to advance liberty in the world. Doctor, welcome to this interview.
Thank you for the invitation.
And I'd love to talk about the state of liberal ideas in the world today, how they evolved over time, and what kind of schools are dominating today. And basically, is liberty and liberal ideas something that people are concerned about more today than they were, let's say, a couple of decades ago? So let's take that stage by stage. But generally, how would you assess, the state of liberal ideas in the world today?
I would say the state of liberal ideas is definitely moving in a very forward direction. I think especially with the social media and the internet, people are discovering these ideas all over the world. So you can go to any country in the world, perhaps excluding North Korea, and you will find people who are interested in liberal ideas, committed to liberal ideas, and educated about liberal ideas. So wherever you go, you will find people who know about leading figures like Friedrich Hayek or Robert Nozick or Milton Friedman. These are now familiar figures around the world. So I'm very optimistic about the spread of liberal ideas.
More and more people today are talking about the financial crisis, about the failure of liberal ideas as some concepts. Do you think it stands in the world?
Yes, no, I definitely think that the financial crisis was a setback for the spread of liberal ideas, that there was two competing narratives to explain what happened to the financial crisis. One which emphasized the failure of markets, and the other which blamed it on many government actions, such as intervention in the housing market and financial regulations which encourage bad investments. Unfortunately, the former narrative of blaming the market came to dominate the discussion rather than those who emphasized the failure of government as an explanation for it. On the other hand, we've seen in response to the crisis that governments have not been very effective in trying to deal with the consequences. So we may want a difference between explanations of the causes and who to blame, and I think we largely lost that debate. And on the question of the consequences, has governments done a very good job of responding to those consequences? I think people have become disillusioned with the ability of government to do a good job. So, for example, we see in the United States a massive shift in the number of people, particularly among young people, who say that they do not believe that government does a very good job. So the government does a good job, or does the market do a better job? More and more young people are saying the government is doing a very bad job.
But what about the market?
And to some extent also more support for the market, although much of that depends on how you phrase the question.
Right.
So opinion polls often vary depending on the term that you use. So one thing we know, for example, in the United States anyway, that if you use the word capitalism, people tend to view it in a rather negative way. If you use the free market, they see that in a positive way. And in America, they particularly like the phrase free enterprise, gets even more positive support.
Mm-hmm. But why do you think we lost the debate on the causes?
I think it's because we did not give sufficient attention to macroeconomic questions. So if you look at what were free market economists writing on before the financial crisis, it was overwhelmingly on microeconomic questions, how regulation caused problems in specific markets. And I think we made some success on that. But because we are very often suspicious of macroeconomic policy making, we saw that there were very few of our free market economists who were working on macroeconomic questions. So I think that's one major reason why we lost. And the second major reason that we lost is that I still think you have an enormous influence on people's perceptions of what happened during the Great Depression in the 1930s. That still the common narrative, the dominant narrative, is that the Great Depression was caused by the failure of the market, and it was interventionism, what we might call Keynesianism, that helped to save the world economies. Whereas there is a competing narrative associated with Milton Friedman, which said, no, it was government actions that caused the Great Depression, and the interventionism that we saw actually lengthened and deepened the Great Depression. So again, there was competing narratives, but it was the one that blamed the market that was the dominant narrative. So I think those are the two main explanations about why we lost that debate about the causes of the recession.
And you mentioned Milton Friedman. Nowadays, I hear a lot from people in Eastern Europe that, well, you guys refer to Milton Friedman, to Friedrich Hayek, to Mises. You are outdated. The world is no longer there. You're just lagging behind intellectually, because what you're talking about today was, topical, let's say, in the US or Western Europe several decades ago. Would you agree with that, or do you think we should really go back to the roots and look at, the dominant schools that were there in classical liberalism several decades ago?
Oh, I think the message of economic freedom is still a valid message. That we know from history that those societies which pursue more free market policies are both more peaceful, more secure, and more prosperous. So the empirical evidence is there. What I would say is that very often the examples that people used, like Milton Friedman, we may need to update with newer examples. And I think we need to find new communicators to address these ideas, articulate these ideas in a new world. But I think it's still as valid, the arguments they used by Milton Friedman or Friedrich Hayek are as valid today as they once were. But we need to update how we articulate them to reach a new generation.
What would you suggest here? Like you said, new communicators, new ways to communicate. Is it just using, contemporary social networks, or is it something more?
Well, one interesting question is, why isn't there today someone like Milton Friedman? Why don't we have major figures in economics like a Milton Friedman that both is a major figure inside the economics profession? He was president of the American Economics Association, but also widely known through television, through television and through newspaper columns. So one question is, why don't we have such a figure today? And I think part of the explanation for that is that economics as a profession has become increasingly narrow. So economists deal with relatively small, narrow questions, and they don't apply their ideas to a wider audience. And the second problem is I think there actually is within academia some hostility to the idea that you should try and reach a wider audience or become a public intellectual. That very often you're seen as not being that serious if you're trying to reach a wider audience.
We still have Joseph Stiglitz, for instance, who is doing a great job, I think, in terms of promoting his ideas, which are quite hostile to what we think the world should be.
Right. Well, obviously there are such people that you see. Paul Krugman, for example, is a very well-known figure about that. But there, I think you see the problem with Paul Krugman is that he's almost come to betray his intellectual ideas. So if you look at some of the things he wrote in his intellectual work and in his books, then that has to be treated very seriously. But then you read some of his columns and he is saying things which are directly contradictory to some of the things he wrote in his academic works. So increasingly, people who really respected Krugman as an economist does not respect him as a public intellectual.
But why do you think it happened? Like, is it just a difference of genres?
That's partly obviously a question that writing for an academic audience and writing for a public audience is more difficult. It requires a different way of thinking. But I think Friedman demonstrated that you could stick to the same values and principles while approaching a wider audience. I'm not a psychologist. I don't want to go in. I can't say I can understand Krugman's mind, but I think he sees himself now as more as a partisan figure defending a particular set of ideas, and he's willing to use any arguments to support his conclusions. In other words, he's not being a very good intellectual in his public writings.
Mm-hmm. Okay, going back to liberalism, if we look at American universities, how different do you find them from what they were a couple of decades ago in terms of liberal ideas dominating or not dominating the agenda?
Well, here we have to be very careful about using the word liberal.
Oh, yeah, right.
Because in the United States, liberal. The word liberal is somebody who's more on the left.
Right.
So it's another example of Americans destroying the English language. So we need to be clear. So I'm going to use the term left liberal and classical liberal to try and make the distinction between the more European style, although I'm one of those who believes that we should use the word liberal and try and change the American way of using that term, but that's a major challenge. So American universities, I would say, are still dominated by left liberal thinking. That it's in fact becoming often intolerant towards people who express a different point of view from the dominant left liberal thinking. And there's often as much a problem of the university administrators as it is of university teachers and faculty. That often university administrators, using their concern over race and gender, are often trying to oppress free speech on American campuses. And so, for example, many campuses, they try and establish what they call a free speech zone, so that you can only, for example, distribute leaflets or organize a rally in a very specific area on campus. And we had a recent case of a student who tried to give out copies of the US Constitution to students outside the student union, and the university police stopped him from doing that. And he pointed to the free speech elements in the U.S. Constitution. They were denying him his constitutional rights to, in this case, even to give out the U.S. constitutional document. So on one side, that's pessimistic in that you have an older generation now, which I think are often very intolerant to people who don't agree with their left-wing views. I do think that we are seeing a next generation which is both more libertarian, if you want to use that term, more classical liberal in thinking. So now that you have liberty societies on the vast majority of campuses in the United States, and very often they are more popular, they have more members, more people attending their events than attend the events of the college Democrats or college Republicans. The people are increasingly skeptical towards the political parties, the traditional parties. They're looking for something new, and often libertarian societies are able to bring them new ideas that otherwise they wouldn't come across.
How is it associated with the progress of the Tea Party?
That's a really interesting question. Amazingly, there's not a big overlap between student libertarians and the Tea Party. So one of the things I noticed when the Tea Party movement arose, and I would go just to observe Tea Party events, is how few people there were, few young people I should say, there were at Tea Party events. So the Tea Party has never been very successful in attracting young people to its activities. And that's got worse because I think the Tea Party itself has changed quite a bit from its origin. So if you look at the founding of Tea Party movements, it was very often done by libertarians. and they attracted a lot of people, and even people who are not libertarian. For them, the crucial question was economic issues. So very often you'd have a Tea Party meeting and somebody would raise a social issue. They would be told, we don't deal with social issues. We're only exclusively concerned with issues like the budget deficit. So we'd only focus on economic issues. And one of the students that we supported, she did a study of the posters that people bore in the Tea Party rallies, and she showed that something like about 3% of all the posters that were shown at Tea Party rallies were to do with social issues. It was overwhelmingly, it was about economic issues. But I think there's evidence to suggest that what happened was the rise of the Tea Party attracted a lot of people who were themselves social conservatives, who were, if you like, traditional Republicans, and that has changed, I think, the nature of the Tea Party. So some of the people who were most active in creating the Tea Party at the beginning are no longer involved with the Tea Party, that they don't feel it's they think it's lost its libertarian roots and just become a wing of the Republican Party.
Okay. So students are becoming more, let's say, interested in libertarian ideas and teaching at the university, professors.
Right. So my particular job at the Institute of Humane Studies is helping graduate students who want to become professors, because we think that universities are a very important means for people to discover these ideas. So we don't believe that professors should be propagandists. We don't think they should tell students this is what you should believe. But we do want to make sure that our ideal is that every student at university will at least come across these ideas and have to decide for themselves whether they agree with them or disagree with them. So we currently have 1,400 professors who've been through our programs who are sympathetic to liberty, who are now teaching at universities predominantly in the United States, but some also around the world. So I would say increasingly in academia, people feel the need they have to address libertarian ideas, even if they themselves, as a professor, doesn't agree with them, but they know their students should be aware of that these ideas are out there. So I'm broadly optimistic about change, but it takes a long time.
Right. If we compare what we've just discussed to the UK, where you originally come from, I know you studied at Warwick University, for example. So how different is it there? Because, sometimes the agenda here in Europe and the EU and in the UK might be quite different. It impacts what we are talking about in Eastern Europe more significantly than what the US agenda stands.
So I should say I haven't taught in the United Kingdom for 12 years, so I'm not necessarily most up to date. But The Economist magazine had I think sometime last year, had a front cover about how young people in the United Kingdom were now becoming more libertarian. So they pointed to the fact now that there are lots of universities have libertarian clubs, and opinion polls they've shows that young people in the United Kingdom are much more libertarian than older people. So, for example, they're much more skeptical towards the welfare state than older people are. They're much more critical towards the National Health Service, the government-run healthcare system. So young people are libertarian both in the social sense, for example, of legalizing drugs or legalizing gay marriage, but they're also very libertarian on economic issues in the United Kingdom. If anything, even more than American young people, who would tend to be socially liberal, but it's still not necessarily as free market as British young people are.
Okay, and I think we should conclude with something more important than that. It's your book, Principles for a Fair Society. You've written a perfect book, and it's now spreading across the globe. I know we read it in Belarus. But when writing this book, what were the key messages because liberalism, classical liberalism, is so broad in terms of the ideas that we discussed. What were the key messages you wanted the young people, let's say in Europe, to be aware and to look as some guides in their everyday life?
So to explain, the book was written after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and this foundation, the Yale-Edmondson Foundation, wanted a short guide for young people about the principles of a free society. So I wrote that predominantly to try and explain what things like democracy and freedom and equality before the law, these sorts of principles, what they mean, and why I thought they were important to incorporate within these countries in transition. But I always come back, the most important political value is freedom. People should be free to choose the life that they want to live, as long as they're not harming people in the process. If that's the one message I would want people to take away, that's the one I would suggest.
So it's not different now than it was, let's say, 15 years ago.
Or 100 years ago, or 150 years, or 200 years ago. I still think that freedom is the most important political value.
Okay, thank you very much, and I hope that this book will be read by everyone in Belarus, and that will somehow make the future of the country a little bit better and more optimistic, as you usually say. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.